Hey reader, welcome back to the channel. This is Centaur, and today we are looking at light howitzers, and specifically the light howitzer artillery choice. So we aren't going to be looking at any vehicle-mounted light howitzers today, and how effective they are in bolt action 3rd edition. We'll also do a little bit of looking back to how they've changed from 2nd edition, because there have been a few changes, not many. A couple of range issues, some usage issues, but other than that, mostly the same. And we are going to get into a little bit of math, as is normal for my channel. It's also interesting as we take a look at this one because, and I mentioned this in the intro to my channel video as well. I'm a sucker for traditional field artillery and specifically howitzers. So just know that, when you see me rating them for how effective any howitzer is, light, medium, heavy, just know that you're going to see some bias, almost undoubtedly. I tend to like these things. It's just a fact. Loved it since I was a very small kid. And so because of that, just be prepared. Some of this is going to be based on math. Some of it's going to be user preference. Okay. So if you find that you don't like them, fair enough. Totally cool. Sound off in the comments. I don't mind. But we are going to take a pretty good look at the all-around usage, how you can get the most out of light artillery, light howitzers, roughly of a 75mm caliber in this video. So talking through how we're going to assess it and how good it is, we're going to be looking at stuff that we look at for basically everything. We're going to look at the range and rate of fire. We're going to look at the opportunity cost, how you can better maximize their usage in your list. We're going to look at their pin generation capabilities as distinct from their damage capabilities. And we're going to go pretty deep on math on this one to see what you can reasonably expect and what the best kinds of targets are going to be. We're then going to look at it from a perspective of objective holding and how effective it is for camping objectives, taking care of objectives and such. And then we're going to do a little bit of kind of answering the question, should you be firing them direct or indirect? Because while this made a little less of a difference in 2nd edition, it's a pretty big difference in 3rd edition. Because on the one hand, you're likely to get slightly more hits potentially in a direct fire capability, but you also have to deal with cover saves at that point. So there's going to be some questions there. And then, of course, we'll end as we typically do with target prioritization. We're not going to be talking about changes that I'm going to recommend to the light howitzer because I'll be honest, I think the light howitzer is actually pretty good. I think it has certain things in its favor, certain downsides and drawbacks, and that's healthy for any unit in any game. So to start off with, we've got our range and rate of fire. In 2nd edition, it had a range of 48 inches if you were firing it direct with one shot. Or you could fire it indirect and you gained a minimum range of 24 inches, but a maximum range now of 60. This is pretty common. You start, pretty much every gun is going to be an extra 12 inches worth of maximum range when it goes to indirect. It'll have a minimum range that kind of reflects the fact that it's a little harder to hit things that are up close and personal in this way. In 3rd edition, we saw a slight tweak to this. The minimum ranges for howitzers increased by about 6 inches each. So now we're looking at 30 to 60 inches, which is, nice round numbers, which is always kind of nice. But it does mean that it is easier to get under the gun, so to speak, if you're trying to escape indirect fire. In this sense, it is pretty comparable to the light anti-tank gun, which we talked about pretty recently. Hopefully, editor Aaron will link to that over here. In exchange for the firepower aspect, because the light AT gun fires a better armor-piercing shell at a pen +4, you instead have a +2 modifier because you're only firing an HE 2-inch template. So this means that your high explosive capability and your splash damage, so to speak, is better than an anti-tank gun, a light AT gun, because it only gets a 1-inch HE shell if you choose to load high explosives. But it has slower penetrative power, right? Kind of the trade-off, though, is it also doesn't get a penetration penalty at long range because, again, the actual explosive capability is based on what's inside the shell. It has nothing to do with the velocity of the weapon. So toward that end, while a light AT gun will drop to pen +3 at long range, a light howitzer will always be firing with that +2 to its damage roll, whether it's firing at 1 inch away or at its maximum of, say, 60 inches indirect, right? It's always going to look the same. Now, of course, there are some nations that don't have to make this choice between these two. British armies who get access to the 25-pounder will say, well, why not both, right? Why not have a anti-tank gun and a howitzer that are basically interchangeable? You can fire it as either an anti-tank gun or as a light howitzer in the same turn. Bulgaria also gets a gun that can kind of switch barrels. You have to switch it on in advance, so it's not quite as versatile as the 25 pounder is for the British. But they do get a chance to be able to say, well, you can use it in one way or another. These are very nice. I'm not going to lie. It's always nice when you have that versatility to be able to choose between the two, because sometimes you might need it to serve in an anti-armor role, even if it's just to really crack the can open on a transport, or you may need it to be able to remove more than one, maybe two guys. And so because of that, there is some reason why one might end up choosing to skew toward an army that has a little bit of a simpler choice. I mean, they're paying more points, obviously, for each of these guns that they field, but it does give them a little more versatility. And in most cases, people would say it's worth it. I happen to be one of those people. If you have the chance at taking a British 25 pounder, it's probably worth it to take at least two. When we look at opportunity cost, there are a couple of things to look at. First of all, just from a pure points perspective, it's a very cheap heavy weapon. If you're looking for something that has penetrative power and thus can put pins on tanks, can at least try to crack them open, even if not particularly effectively, at 45 points regular, it's a very efficient use of points in order to do that. Is it better than an AT gun? Is it better than a light autocannon, which also costs about the same number of points? It's exactly the same 50, 50, 50 regular for all three of them in second edition. The light autocannon has a pen +2 modifier, and we'll talk about that one next week. It's getting two shots, but it does suffer that pen -1 at long range. So at longer ranges, maybe it doesn't quite penetrate as well. I think the question between all of those really comes down to strategy. Is your plan when you walk onto the table to try to remove armor? Or is it merely to pin out, slow down, disrupt, and cause the armor to be less effective? If that's the case, if you're leaning toward the former and you really want to open something up, the AT gun is going to be a better option because it's just more reliable and you're going to have more chances to actually do real damage to the target. If you're looking just to pin things down, I think the howitzer or the autocannon are a better choice. It's a slightly harder choice to choose the howitzer in third edition now that the light howitzer does D2 pins instead of D3, which makes it the same number of pins as both a light anti-tank gun and a light autocannon. And I think this is part of the reason, we'll talk about more of the reasons why in the autocannon video, but it's part of the reason why I think we're seeing slightly less howitzers being used and slightly more autocannons. And actually probably dramatically more autocannons, if I'm being honest, even pairing the two up together. And I think the real reason for that distinction is that they're from a pin generation perspective, from a damage perspective, the howitzer is not nearly as competitive as it was in second edition. Now, the real competitive side of the howitzer is the fact that it can fire indirect and it has the ability to use a spotter as long as it is regular or veteran. So potentially you can actually get 6 turns worth of shooting out of a light howitzer. Okay. So toward this end, and I think this is the big question from a strategy perspective, it's do you believe there's going to be a large amount of cover and terrain, obscuring terrain on the table? If so, you might get more work out of a light howitzer than you could possibly even any of the other options from the artillery selection, to be honest. Just because if there aren't long open lanes for you to fire down, an anti-tank gun or an autocannon might not be able to fire until turn 3, maybe even turn 4, possibly not even at all, because it might be that before they get their activation, something turns the corner, shoots at them, and wipes them out or pins them out so that they have to start rallying or they fail order tests or they're just less effective because they're down to 1 crewman. There's a lot of things that could happen. And the advantage of the light howitzer is pretty much from turn 1, as long as you start on the board, which is most scenarios, you could be shooting. As long as you've got a spotter who can help you out, who has easy choice of targets, or you yourself have direct line of sight to something that you want to shoot at. Now, this, I think, begs the question of why you would use it, though, from an opportunity cost perspective, over and against another option for indirect fire. And I think that's a legitimate question, because on the one hand, you can get 2 light mortars for the same cost as 1 light howitzer, right? They're now generating 2 order dice instead of 1. That's 4 bodies instead of 3, which means you can technically take more of a beating. Now, they might run off more easily because as soon as they lose 1 guy, they're morale testing. As soon as you lose 1 guy, you're still fine, right? So, there are some trade-offs there. But technically, from a resilience perspective, they could be better. in that respect. You could potentially be targeting multiple people. They're both doing D2 pins. You get slightly better penetration modifiers, and you might hit slightly more targets with a light howitzer. They start looking pretty similar, right? They're not nearly as different as they were, say, in second edition, where you've got double, almost triple the range. You've got better shot capacity. Light mortars weren't allowed to use spotters. So there were a lot of differences between those two. I think strategically the big reason for taking the howitzer is the fact that it can fire direct, and thus it can cover more avenues, and it can fill more roles than a light howitzer or than a light mortar can. So just keep that in mind. That might be one of the reasons, but I think there's a legitimate question. If you just need indirect fire support, you might just consider going with mortars instead of going with artillery. The other option, of course, in the actual artillery slot and at inexperienced costing about the same amount as a regular light howitzer, you could just take a multiple rocket launcher, right? Now, multiple rocket launchers recently got an errata, so they have to fire indirect, but now they have a 36-inch minimum range, which is more penalizing than the minimum range on a light howitzer. They have a maximum of 72 inches, so it is longer than a howitzer. But at the same time, and they're potentially hitting multiple units. Okay, so that's another consideration. They would be more expensive at the same time if you're taking them regular, which would allow you to use a spotter with the multiple rocket launcher. So it might be more expense, and it's not like they can actually range in on targets, right? You're fishing for sixes every single time you do it. So maybe it works, maybe it doesn't, and it's not particularly reliable for targeting and removing one specific unit. It's really good at just shooting at multiple units that are in the same area, and you might hit one of them, and you don't really have control over which one that one is, right? So I think the question is really more strategic, right? Again, a lot of this is going to come down to strategy or tactics, and at this point, we're still on the strategy side, which is, do you actually want to remove a specific unit? If so, multiple rocket launcher is not a great way to do that. Okay, it's a lot more reliable to do that with a howitzer because you can choose the unit, you start shooting in on the unit, and if you do hit it, you're going to hit it pretty hard. Pen plus 2 is not as good as pen plus 3, which is what you get with a multiple rocket launcher, but against most units that you would want to be shooting at, who are probably going to be regular veterancy or inexperienced veterancy, it's the same. It's twos to wound, right? It's not actually any better in that sense to be pen plus 3 unless you're shooting at a very large number of bodies. And in most cases, a 2-inch template is going to be just fine for catching the number of bodies that you want to catch. So in terms of opportunity cost, I actually think the light mortar does really well. I think it's I'm sorry. I think the light howitzer does really well. Let's cut that part. So in terms of opportunity cost, I think the light howitzer does really well. I think you're getting pretty good value for what you're paying for, and it covers quite a few roles for you. As we look at pin generation, its pin generation is actually also pretty good. In second edition, you could reliably get, about 2 hits or so with a light howitzer, maybe 3. So put it around 6 pins per game. Okay, I was doing D3 pins per time, roughly 3 hits per game, more or less. It all depends on how you chose to shoot. But you could probably get at least 3 hits or so, and it'll give you about 6 pins per game. That means that at 50 points regular, you're looking at paying about 8 to 12 points per pin that you're doing, which is actually pretty good, right? I mean, it could be a whole lot worse in terms of how that all works out. But it's gonna be roughly about 8 to 12, 9 to 10 points per pin. In third edition, even though you drop to D2 pins, your chances of hitting is actually slightly higher. So because of that, you're still looking at about 2 to 3 hits per game, more or less. So it comes out to about 4 to 5 pins on average. But at 45 points regular, assuming that you don't buy the gun shield, if you buy the gun shield, changes the math slightly, you're looking at about 9 to 10 points per pin. But even if you do include the gun shield, you're still within that roughly 12 points per pin category in terms of what you're looking at. So on the whole, honestly, for this game, that's pretty good value. A lot of units are going to do a lot less than that. They're going to have to pay more points in order to get that level of pinning. So as a pin machine, even at D2 pins, the light howitzer does pretty okay. Not the best in the game, but still pretty good. Damage potential. Now, as we're looking at damage potential, there's obviously a lot that goes into this, right? So I am assuming for this that you're not taking these howitzers inexperienced. You can technically do that. If you're doing that, you're probably using them indirect fire all the time. And I think with that 30-inch minimum range, you're really taking a risk that following turn 2 or turn 3, you're not really going to get a chance to shoot at anything, okay? And so the math here, what it's designed to reflect is assuming a roughly 4+ to hit and that you do get 6 turns worth of shooting, Okay, so you're not being wiped out early. A mortar doesn't have your name on it when it starts shooting at you. You haven't been overrun by somebody else. So all of these do make assumptions. What is your chance of actually doing damage to a target? Okay. And so working from highest level of damage value to an inexperienced infantryman, a horse-drawn limber, or a Tashanka, so a literal horse, right, with no armor, we find that obviously you can't actually do any damage period to a damage value 11 tank. You only have a +2 modifier. It's in the range where you just can't actually damage a Tiger 2. Okay. Damage value 10 vehicles, it's low, 2.8%. Basically, you have to be shooting at it from the rear, which is very rare. It can happen, especially in a fog of war scenario, where if they decided they wanted to bring their damage value 10 tank on your side of the battlefield, and you've got 2 light howitzers kind of in the corners, kind of crisscrossing the battlefield, you would have a decent chance at getting a rear shot as long as they came in and turned, which is a pretty common tactic, actually, where you kind of form this conga line of vehicles right now when you're using Fog of War. So there's actually a non-zero chance that you'd get a chance at a rear shot going this way. The problem, of course, is you got to hit, and then you got to get a 6 on the damage roll, and then you got to get a 6 on the damage chart because you only glance the target, and then they got to fail and run away. So, like, it's low. It's very low. Okay, your chances of getting this are not very good, but it could potentially happen. Okay. Against a damage value 9 vehicle, it's still really low, mostly because you need to be hitting the rear, the side, or the top. Top being very difficult to do. You'd have to get the plunging fire rule, which means you'd have to be within 12 inches of them and at a higher elevation than them, and that is not likely. Of course, the other way you can get top armor on this is you could just fire indirect. Getting a tank to stay still for that is a little harder, although if editor Aaron is able to link to it down below in the description, Bo Mortensen just did a video pretty recently talking about how to use light mortars and other small units of things to kind of bully around even bigger tanks. And that's one way you could do it. You know, there are ways to put enough pins on a tank that it has to rally or it's going to fail its order and go down or something else like that, that will keep it in place so that you have a better chance of ranging in on it. So, like, it's not impossible to get a top shot, but one could hypothetically get a top shot, and that would help. But again, you'd be spending quite a few turns trying to shoot in on it and then trying to hit it and actually damage it and then actually destroy it. It's not particularly high. Okay. As you start getting damage value 8, this is where things start to change. The number of shots you need to take and the chances of doing damage go up dramatically because of the fact that you can hit it at any range against any facing. And so your chances of removing a DV8 vehicle and actually destroying it outright are still very small because you're still looking for, you know, you're still only glancing the target. You might do slightly better than that if you can hit it in the side or something like that. But in general, you're planning on glancing it. You're still just trying to set it on fire effectively is what you're trying to do. It doesn't happen very often. Okay. As you start getting to damage value 7, though, realistically, if you're getting 4 or 5 shots against a target in the game, you might actually make this happen. Okay. You can do this from any facing at any range. And you're always having a chance at blowing them up outright. If you can get that 6 to wound, then you're at 50-50 odds. And so your chances go up to about a 20%, more or less a 20%. So about 1 in 5, which in bolt action, by the way, is not horrible. Okay. 1 in 5 chance in bolt action is not bad at all, but you could potentially do it. Now, when you start getting to damage value 6, everything changes. Everything gets easier. First of all, because we might be talking about infantry at this point. It's rare that you end up with a damage value 6 on infantry, but there are some infantry that, you know, allow them to, you know, mitigate and adjust what the wounding difficulty is on them. But in general, this is going to be your soft skin vehicles. Soft skin vehicle is also nice, and it does improve your chances by a decent bit because you don't have to roll in a damage chart. If you do damage to them, in this case, a 4+ to wound, you're going to remove it. And that means that even in a single shot, 4+ to hit, 4+ to wound, that's a 25% chance, right? It's half and then half of that, which comes out to 1/4. 25% chance that if you take 1 shot at a transport that is soft-skinned, you might remove it. 1 shot at an anti-aircraft gun on the back of a truck, and you might remove it, which again, bolt action, not bad math. And when you look at DV5 and below, you actually get a slightly, you know, it's a slight gradation going up, but really what this one comes down to is that your chances are going to be pretty decent because of the fact that these are infantry for the overwhelming majority of cases, right? It could be a damage value 3 plus tow. It could be a damage value 3 plus Tashanka tank selection option, which is literally a machine gun in a horse-drawn carriage, is what a Tashanka is. So, like in that sense, in most cases, it's going to be infantry, and so you've got multiple chances to try to wound. It could be other stuff, but in most cases, it's going to be infantry. And in these cases, you're looking at almost a 50% chance of getting them. It's going to be slightly below 50% because obviously you have a 4+ to hit, right? So you would have to be wounding on like literally ones in order to get a 50% chance. So with the knowledge you can't get above a 50% on account of only having one shot trying to hit on at least a 4+, a 42% or 33% chance is not horrible at all. And especially since you get to roll potentially multiple times, right? For multiple models, it's a 33 to 42% chance on each one of them, right? So the chance you actually do something on a hit is quite high. Now, obviously, there are some ways to adjust for this, and so we're going to talk about, we'll talk about how, there are some adjustments that need to be made based on cover saves and stuff like that. So don't worry, we'll talk about those later. The big thing that I think is useful to note here is that you aren't really shooting for the sky very often on these. Okay, you are doing a good bit of reliable, solid damage as long as you're hitting. But this is also why some people don't like howitzers. It's a one-shot item, which means you either hit or you don't. It's, you're either doing something to the enemy or you're not doing anything at all on the turn. And that's fair. It's an important consideration. Definitely should look into that. As we look at objective holding, it's arguably gotten a little bit worse, but also in some respects a little bit better. Okay. In second edition, it had the benefit of the gun shield, which meant that it increased the difficulty to wound the guys in the crew by 1 as long as they were being attacked from the front. So a regular crew was being wounded as if they were veteran, which is awesome. An inexperienced crew was even being wounded as if they were regular, which is really good. Okay. Add on to that potential cover in order to mitigate hits against them, the ability to then go down on top of that. It was actually relatively easy for a gun crew to make it so that you were hitting them on 6s by 6s. It was relatively easy to do. That is not nearly as easy to do now. Okay. As far as objective holding goes, they're still okay in third edition as regards defensive capabilities, because again, they can go down, which does give them the potential for a save if they don't have one. They have the access to a gun shield, but the gun shield just gives you the same save as if you were down, which is fine. It means you could go down to get a 3+ save, but it also means that if you go in the forest and then get a gun shield, they don't stack. So you're just kind of wasting points on the gun shield. So there are legitimate questions in third edition on whether to buy the gun shield or not. It's also why, for the math perspective, I listed it as a 45-point regular light howitzer instead of 50, because I didn't assume that you were taking the gun shield. But it does mean that, at least in general, a light howitzer crew is relatively reasonable in terms of its difficulty to remove. It is harder to remove than a machine gun team. It is harder to remove than a mortar, because it technically does have access to the ability to take better cover in the case of a gun shield if it has to be put in the open. And if you want to have those open lanes, sometimes the only open lanes you're going to find are on a road. So you might have to be half of the model sitting out on the road, so maybe a gun shield comes in useful. Okay. But that's at least something we're thinking about. It's also good for objective holding because it has good counter battery fire capability. It can help to handle enemy mortars. It can handle enemy howitzers. It can help to deal with enemy self-propelled guns. It can shoot pretty effectively against units that are trying to camp another objective. It still has the ability to fire direct, which means it can help to protect itself as well in the process. And that also makes it really good on ambush. If you want to put it on ambush because you know somebody's going to come around a corner to come to the objective, you can do that. And when they don't have any cover, light them up. Quite effective. It can also do well without ambush, because you don't really need ambush if you're planning to do, indirect fire. I don't know how often I would plan on solely doing indirect fire, but the point is that you don't feel like you need the ambush order in order to make these things work. Some units are only really good on objective holding if they can guarantee the ambush. These guys, they're pretty equal opportunity. Whatever you give them, they will work pretty well to defend a specific position from specific lanes of fire. They also have a very long reach, right? So you can use them to support you on the other side of the board, which is always kind of nice. And the fact that they can do it with indirect fire means they're slightly more reliable than, say, a heavy machine gun, an anti-tank gun, other heavy weapons. that are also, kind of in a sit back supporting role. It can do it slightly better than that because of the fact that it can potentially shoot over large amounts of enemies and terrain in order to get to something that it wants to hit. It has the ability to reactive fire if assaulted from the front, which is always nice. It means it's not technically as good as an AT rifle or a light mortar, because it does have that fixed property. But it's not purely indirect fire like a mortar is. And so because of that, it does at least have some capability to be able to defend itself if it's being charged by a normal infantry squad within 12 inches of it. Obviously, in terms of drawbacks and things that are something of a holdback in terms of objective holding, it is fixed, which means if people are swooping around from a different direction, they're going to have to advance in order to change their facing in order to shoot at stuff. That's a consideration, something to think about. It is also going to be a magnet for mortars. It's just a fact. If somebody has a light mortar, a light howitzer is a great target because if it even removes a couple of the crewmen, it's probably done its job. Whereas light howitzer, even doing counter battery fire against a light mortar team, maybe you've removed your points worth, maybe you've removed enough threat, maybe you haven't, right? Again, if you're taking 2-to-1, it all depends, right? You might have to remove 2 sets of light mortars in order to keep yourself safe or in order to make up your value. So there are legitimate questions to that. On the whole, I don't think there's a reasons not to take it. I think in general, this is a really good choice, and artillery in general tends to be a really good choice for holding objectives and defending them. And the light howitzer is a very economical way to do that. When looking at direct and indirect fire, there are reasons to do both in game. However, I think there are reasons to lean away from a light howitzer if depending on what your tactical decisions are with the howitzer. Okay, if your plan is to only fire indirect, I would probably just take a mortar. Okay, you're going to save points on a comparable mortar doing comparable damage. Um, a medium mortar with a spotter is probably better than a light howitzer using somebody else's spotter, for a lot of reasons, but most notably because you're not overpaying for the ability to fire in direct, right? The light howitzer is paying to be able to fire in either a direct roll or in an indirect roll. The mortar can only fire in direct, but it gets added range. And in the case of the medium mortar, which is also 45 points regular, it can take a spotter of its own. So it's not clogging up the need for one gun, one spotter. It isn't borrowing from somebody else and leaving somebody else blind, right? If you're planning on taking the light mortar inexperienced and only firing it in an indirect fire roll, personally, I would probably still just take a mortar, okay? You could do this, and it's actually quite cheap as a way of doing it. You wouldn't be able to use spotters. That's fine. If you're only planning on firing it indirect, you'd still have to be able to see the targets with your own direct line of sight. And so I think you're going to be a little bigger of a footprint and a little harder to hide than your average mortar team. So personally, I would probably just take a mortar. But I mean, you could technically do it. It's technically cheaper than a comparable medium mortar. So, you're saving some points. That's always nice. I don't think I would do it, but feel free to try it. We're new in the edition. Might as well just give it a go. You might find something. Maybe I'm wrong. And maybe in a year or two, we'll come back to this video and see if I made a big mistake and maybe do a revamp of it. If you have a good firing lane that you can look down, I think tactically you start with planning on firing direct. Just cover down the lane. You could do ambush if you need to. When somebody pops around a corner or turns out, so that way they don't have any cover available to them, you take a shot at them, right? But then if you need to, if there's nothing else better to shoot at and you have targets that you can indirect fire against, why not? Just try fate. You might roll a 6. You might end, maybe you activate near the end of the turn and then you activate near the beginning of the next turn. And so you have a chance to range in twice against a unit before they really get a chance to try to get away. And so maybe now you've got 5s to wound and maybe you get them, right? And you do some damage before they even come out. All of that is advantageous. All of that is helpful. And then if you have limited line of sight, if you have reason to believe that, you've got like a lot of buildings, maybe a lot of forest, maybe you're playing on a jungle board and there's just a lot of, forest rough terrain all over the place. So you don't really have a lot of good shots. I think the light howitzer is a really good choice because you have a chance to fire indirect if you want to. And then if you're threatened by hostile troops, if people start getting close to you, if they breach some of those tree lines that are near you, or if they're coming down a lane, then you can switch to doing direct fire in order to protect yourself, right? Which I think is really nice. And it is nice to have that versatility. And this is the kind of thing that a howitzer, that a mortar, for example, doesn't have. So now we're going to do a little bit of a deep dive into why you would want to go one way or another from a damage perspective. Okay. Because I do think if you're planning on doing indirect fire almost exclusively versus direct fire exclusively, it changes the math a little in terms of what you can expect from a damage potential, but not by as much as you might think it does. So as we're looking at this, looking at the number of hits you can reasonably expect to get, if you're firing indirect and you're planning on firing indirect for most of the game, on balance, you're probably going to get about 1 to 2 hits per game. Okay. It depends on a lot of factors. Depends on whether or not you need to go down. It depends on whether the unit that you're firing on is a smaller team weapon and maybe you wipe it out in a single shot. And so then you got to start rearranging in on another unit. And so maybe you get it in during that same game. Maybe you don't. There's just a lot of questions on it as to how that works. How many units do they choose to put in your direct, indirect fire radius versus just moving them up really, really close, so that way they're underneath the gun, so to speak. But I think you can plan on getting about 1 to 2 hits per game indirect. In terms of direct fire, you could probably get about 2 to 3 in terms of legitimate hits on target, assuming that they're not stacking tons of pins on you, or maybe you have an officer nearby in order to just help to make sure the guns keep going, which is not a bad idea, by the way. I think 2 to 3 is probably about accurate in terms of what you could expect to get. Now, when we look at number of wounds that these can do, that very much depends on how your opponent does their formation. So if they are stretching them out in one thin conga line, and they've put roughly about an inch, just shy of an inch below, between each of the units, you might only hit 2 guys with each shot, which is why our minimum is set at 2. But even then, assuming you're firing inexperienced and regular units, which is what I would personally target, we'll see this when we talk about target prioritization in a little bit, you're winning on 2s, which means if you're getting 2 hits, actually your chances of getting 2 wounds is pretty high. It's not exactly 100%, but it isn't even below 75%, by the way. So like you're looking okay in terms of your chances of doing wounds. So I think doing at least 2 wounds is pretty reasonable. Okay. Now there is technically a way to get as many, even off of only 2 hits. You get as many as 10 wounds reliably off of that. Now, this does require our opponent to set up in a very specific formation, and I don't think it's particularly smart, but it can happen. And so for this, I'm going to very carefully, hopefully, turn down the camera, and with a little bit of movie magic, we're going to take a look at what that formation would look like. And movie magic. So here we've got a bunch of Greek soldiers that I've been working on recently. These come from a Kickstarter that I backed. I believe you can find the miniatures on My Mini Factory under, I believe it was Battle Cat, if I'm not mistaken. But yeah, they're on My Mini Factory. If you look up Greece, bolt action, World War II, there aren't too many of them. So you'll find them there. And if we assume that, say, like there's a building right in front of them, and they've hidden behind that building so as to be out of line of sight of a lot of enemy units, and let's say that they're next to an objective. This is a kind of thematic objective that I'm building for a bunch of my maps. In this case, a snow map. I like to include things like Piats and ammo and stuff like that on there to kind of show what it is that you're going for. Maybe you do like a couple of crates and barrels, or uh, you know, assault rifles and crates and stuff like that. But just something interesting to tell you this is clearly a point of interest and something that you should be going for, some sort of objective to be maintained. And so they've decided to hide behind this building. And you decide with your light howitzer using your spotter to try to shoot at them to help to clear them off. Even though you only have a 2-inch radius on your HE template, if you were to center that on the midpoints of the second line of guys, you would overlap 6 models. I don't think there's a way to get more than that. Possibly. Yeah, I don't think you even can, because you're going halfway into the models on these sides and you're only clipping the edges of the bases on both of these guys. So I think 6 is probably about the maximum you could catch, but you could potentially catch 6. And if that's the case, then one could get 6 hits with a single pen plus 2 shot. This assumes then, assuming again law of averages, that you're going to roll a 1, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5, and a 6. And if that's the case, then one of them is going to be a failure to wound, and the other 5 are going to be successful wounds. And so when we look at the chart, that's why we talk about potentially 5 wounds per shot. Up to 2 shots would give you a potential expected ceiling of 10. But to be honest, again, like your opponent would have to set up in a very specific setup. They can have slightly more variance in there. So if they're in any of those, if you see any of those like move trays that are kind of pre-generated on like, laser cut files or something like that, you might still be able to catch 6 potentially, but reasonably, I think you should plan on between 2 to 4, to be honest. So 2 to 4 is what I would expect, at which point you'd get about 2 to 3 wounds off of each. So your actual expected ceiling of wounds would probably be somewhere closer to 6. But for the sake of the math considerations, technically, it is possible to get 6 hits on average, 5 wounds on a single shot. Now, for direct fire, if we assume something similar, again, whatever it is that we're looking at there, then we can assume, okay, you're probably still going to get, with 2 to 3 hits, 4 wounds ish, roughly about 2 wounds for each shot. And if you can catch those, catch 6 dudes, wound 5, you could get as many as 15. Okay. Again, you have to be fighting a very specific army, but hey, maybe you're fighting a partisan army and they're having to be really grouped up because there's just a lot of them and it's thin corridors or something like that. It could potentially happen. If it does, you'd be getting around 15 wounds. In this sense, you can see direct fire because it's generally going to get more hits than indirect fire, just because of chances of ranging in and stuff like that. You're slightly more likely to be able to get more out of your direct fire aspect. However, the math changes if there's a cover save. The moment there's a chance at a save, indirect fire becomes a lot more appealing because indirect fire ignores the save. So you're still looking at probably an expectation of about 2, but you could get potentially as high as 10, probably closer to 4. Okay, is probably what you're expecting. You're going to catch, 3 guys maybe. So you're looking at, 3 to 6 as kind of your higher ceiling of what you can expect. For direct fire, because you're losing, assuming a 4+ cover save, which is relatively reasonable, it might be closer to 5s, depending on what you're shooting at, whether they go down with no cover. But as soon as they go down in any kind of cover whatsoever, or if you're using this to clear out infiltrators like snipers or forward observers or things like that, you're looking at probably closer to a 4+ save, maybe even better than that. And so my assumption is we're just going to go with a 4+ just to kind of keep things relatively even. And if that's the case, you're looking at closer to 2 to 8. 2 to 7 in terms of wounds, and it's probably going to be actually closer to 2 to 4, to be honest. It's going to be a lot smaller than that. So in that sense, I don't think the indirect fire is a bad idea. I think indirect fire still holds up. It's still going to get a decent number of wounds on target as long as you're firing at the right targets. And so with that, we'll talk a little bit about how you choose what those targets are. Okay, first of all, I think the best targets for these are going to be team weapons. If you have a chance to be able to fire on something like a machine gun team or a mortar team or a sniper team, even to some extent like a forward observer with a furtherman or 2, this is a really good choice for your light howitzer. It's very easy to get your value back. It's very easy to get something useful off the table. It's not trading big blows. It's not making necessarily big plays, but those are also units that serve as really, really good both supporting fire units, and some units are only going to work effectively when they've got guys backing them up. So that's always nice. It can also be a great way of removing guys who are on like a far back objective that your opponent really didn't want to have to leave a lot of guys at. So as soon as you start even threatening that unit, they're going to have to pull guys back from the rest of the assault. And that's advantageous for you. Highly advantageous for you. It also works decently well against regular and veteran infantry sections. You're kind of losing a little bit against inexperienced sections just because of the fact that you're still wounding on 2s, which is the same as regulars, right? You don't get the chance of wound on 1s available to you. Against veterans, it's also pretty reasonable because +2 penetration is actually relatively difficult to get against a veteran, considering that heavy weapons have to use their HE values. Most HE on most heavy weapons is only going to be a 1-inch. Right? Which means they're only getting pen +1. So they're only wounding 50% of the time. You're wounding 33% of the time. 66% of the time because you only need a 3+. So that ain't bad. You could really make that work. It's also a really good choice against artillery because the artillery, similar to the howitzer, They don't want to be moving. They really don't want to have to reconverge to a different area in order to escape being ranged in case you're doing ranging in. Some guns can't move at all unless they're being hitched up to a tow, which is extremely cumbersome. And honestly, if you can get a gun to be hitched to a tow, towed somewhere else, and then redeployed, I mean, I would count that as a huge win and probably worth just taking the howitzer on its own because you just took a gun out of the fight for 2 turns. They're probably not doing very much with that gun either at this point. So if your 45-point regular gun using somebody's spotter or not just took a bigger gun out of the fight for 2 turns, I think that's fantastic. They work really well against soft skin transports and tows because they're getting really good chances to wound. It's about a 50% chance to wound, roughly, depending on obviously the kind of the kind of tow, because some tows are technically armored. But like in most cases, for what people are running, relatively easy to wound, relatively easy to hit. They can be quite large sometimes, so getting cover for them can also be relatively difficult to do. So you can be quite effective against those. And then against lightly armored vehicles, they're fine. If you don't have anything else better to shoot at, a lightly armored vehicle is okay. Know that you're mostly going for pins. You're not likely to actually crack them open. Again, looking at the damage potential from up above, you're looking at 20% or lower in terms of chances, which is not great. It's not horrible, but it isn't great. So toward that end, as we're looking at light howitzers, I mean, I give them the thumbs up. I think if you're looking at taking an artillery platoon, you would be in very good shape to take a light howitzer. I would probably take two, honestly, just because one, I think that they are more effective if you have multiples of these threats going around. For a lot of nations, you don't have a lot of things that are a whole lot better to take, although we'll see in our next video when we look at the light autocannon. That might be a really good choice for you as a potential option in your artillery platoon. I think the big question that you're going to want to have is how much do you really want to invest in your artillery platoon? Because a heavy weapons platoon can give you mortars, which are just as effective, maybe even more so, depending on what you're looking at. They can also give you machine gun teams for covering those lines of fire. So yes, you might need to buy 2 team weapons to kind of do the same kind of role as a light howitzer, but that means that those 2 teams can also do both of those roles at the same time, whereas light howitzer is having to switch between the two. So I think there's a legitimate question about that. If you're planning on adding an armored platoon to the list too, you can lose a lot of points very quickly that way, and you still have to take your rifle platoon on top of that. So in general, when it comes to 3rd edition, I think the light howitzer is a nice choice because even if all you ran were 2 regular light howitzers, no gun shield, no none of that, keep it at 90 points, and a single inexperienced officer to lead them. If you're using the new rules that came out with Armies of Germany, and I think all of the books as they're going forward, where if you take it with a pistol, it's -1 to the cost of the guy, you're only looking at 110 points. That's less than 10% at 1250, which is fantastic because then you still have enough room for your rifle platoon to take up about, 400, 500 points. And you can make it substantial if you want to. You can still take a heavy weapons platoon for around 200, 250, maybe even 300 points if you wanted to, and still have room for multiple pieces of armor if you wanted to. Right. So it's helping to it's helping to support all of the other pieces. It isn't taking away any of the stuff that you really might like. But at the same time, it's going to be providing some of that nice flexible firepower that has quite a bit of utility for chomping through heavy weapon platoons, artillery platoons, and infantry platoons with something to do against armored vehicles. So on the whole, I think you could do a lot worse than taking a light howitzer. They are relatively prolific. Warlord, as you can tell from the pictures that we've done throughout this presentation, has made quite a few of these, and most nations have a light howitzer. In as much as we don't have one of these, from Warlord Games, Rubicon makes quite a few of these. Lots of people actually make quite a few of these. It's very rare that you have a Kickstarter for anything that doesn't include a 75mm howitzer. Okay, so relatively easy to find, relatively easy to access, and very effective. So from us over here at Zern, they get the thumbs up. If you like this video, please let us know down below. We look forward to seeing your comments, and I will see you next time.